Okay, so let's get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Literary Zoom lecture brought to you by Wilton Library. I'm Michael Bellicosa, Community Engagement Manager here at the library, and I'm very pleased to be introducing this lecture, which is made possible with the support of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley. Because we have a large audience, we'll handle the Q&A at the end as follows. You can send me your questions using the Q&A button, and I will relay them to Mark after his lecture. And by the way, because he has a tight schedule today, we'll be concluding right at 6 after some Q&A. And Mark is always happy to answer questions that you can email him later. If you need his email address, just let me know and I'll pass it along. Mark Schenker has been at Yale College since 1990 and is currently a Senior Associate Dean of the College and Dean of Academic Affairs. A former lecturer in the English department at Yale, he received his PhD from Columbia University with a concentration in 19th century and early 20th century English literature. For over 30 years, Dean Schenker has lectured on literature and film and has led book discussion series in more than 100 venues in Connecticut, including public libraries and retirement communities, museums, and cultural centers. With that, join me in welcoming Mark, and I turn the podium over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Michael, for all your help in getting this series together, as with the other ones, and welcome everyone for coming out virtually. This series is modeled on the series I did most recently on what's Victorian about the Victorian novel, this asking a similar question, what's modern about the modern British novel? And I say that because if you're new to these lectures, I'm not going to be talking about each of these 4 books with the kind of attention that I would be giving it if this were a continuing education course or a course in a college or a high school on these novels. Instead, I'm going to be talking about the cultural moment. We're doing one novel from each of the first 4 decades of the 20th century, The Secret Agent, 1907, by Conrad, Howard's End, 1910, by Foster, Mrs. Dalloway, 1925, by Virginia Woolf, and Brighton Rock, 1938, by Graham Greene, in order to talk about how these disparate writers had things in common that united them and distinguished them in contrast to the Victorian novel. So Virginia Woolf said in an essay she wrote in 1924 called Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, Mr. Bennet is Arnold Bennett and Mrs. Brown is J.Q. Public, just any person. She wrote in or about December 1910, human character changed. She picked that day because that was the mounting of the post-impressionist exhibit of paintings. And she was making an argument that in the same way that post-impressionism was modern as distinguished from impressionist painters, modern British novels saw that human character was no longer something stable and communal and to be taken for granted. And so you didn't have to write as Mr. Bennet, Arnold Bennett would, the conventional novel in which a character's internal life is considered to be like other people's internal life, and characters can be shown by how they respond to challenges, overcoming adversity. And typically a novel then must take place in months or years to show you the trajectory of somebody's life. She argued that if human character exists, it exists in every moment. And so she, like James Joyce, thought you could show a character in the course of a single 24-hour day, as Joyce did with Ulysses, and as she herself did with Mrs. Dalloway. So this notion that there's a change in human character is central. Other issues in the period are what has been called the condition of England. England came through the Industrial Revolution, urbanization, increasing rights for women, increasing suffrage for more and more men. How is old England going to survive those changes? Many of the novels are directly or indirectly concerned about the extended effects of World War I. A great interest in new uses of time and history and myth, and very much an interest, fixation really, on the alienation and exile of the artist. Writers in the 17th and 18th century who conceived of themselves as literary artists did not think of themselves as alienated. John Donne, John Milton, William Shakespeare would have thought of themselves as representatives of their society, not alienated. And the same would be true for George Eliot and Thackeray and Dickens and Henry James. They would not have thought of themselves as in any way in conflict. That's not true of D.H. Lawrence or Virginia Woolf, a woman writing in the modernist period, or James Joyce, an Irishman, and so Graham Greene, a Catholic, Joseph Conrad, a Pole. That is not your typical John Bull English writers. So we are going to, throughout this quartet of lectures, be continually involved with modernism as both a theme, that is their writing in the modern world. You can conceive of that as roughly the period between the two world wars. Modern does not mean contemporary. We are contemporaries in 2011, and 10 years from now, that date will be contemporary. So contemporary is not really very good unless you're talking about decoration or furniture. Modernism is a period that is now quite old, 100 years or more, and it rose in response to a feeling among many artists and intellectuals that progress had strayed too far from the power and value of the fundamental sources of human existence. If you're going to take one thing away from this lecture, and I hope you'll take at least one, it's that in response to feeling that the world had become too technological, too big, too disparate, too atomistic, people all separated, there was a longing to go back to the primitive. And when I say the primitive, I mean that in the elemental sense of pre-industrial, that we would revitalize our modern life if we could get in touch with what is shown in the art of Picasso and his exploration of African and other cultures. If we could appreciate Stravinsky's use of pagan themes in The Rite of Spring, which premiered in 1913. If we could understand T.S. Eliot's critical view of the contemporary world as a wasteland when contrasted to the Hindu and Buddhist and cross-cultural myths of Western civilization. If we could understand why Joyce felt he had to appropriate the Odyssey in his epic novel Ulysses, which was published, like The Wasteland, in 1922. Both of those works, Ulysses and The Wasteland, for all their differences, are post-World War I novels, works. It took until the 1920s for culture to have enough distance from the war to talk about it in critical and not jingoistic terms. So this idea of the primitive, and I want to say again, that's not a negative value judgment. Think of it as fundamental, the things that are in a human being's relationship to nature, to responsibility for each other. So we see the primitive invoked, in fact, enacted in today's novel when Winnie Verloc kills her husband Adolf with a carving knife, and it's described as being done with the simple ferocity of the age of caverns. She kills him primitively with a knife because she realizes he has betrayed her and allowed her impaired brother to be killed. And she's described as somebody free of convention with the simple ferocity of the age of caverns. If you haven't finished the novel and you haven't yet gotten to that scene, do not let this spoiler stop you from reading it. It is remarkably well narrated. So this notion that some of these novels are very concerned with the primitive. D.H. Lawrence writes his novels about sex and sexuality, not because he's trying to be obscene, not because he's trying to push convention or to shock the middle class, which was a great theme in the 1890s and the beginning of the 20th century, because he believed that a fundamental return to the value of the body, of nature, of sexuality, of sensuality would redeem modern people from the desiccation of modernity, from the blankness of the machine, from automated life. And so he is the most evangelical of all the writers of this period. He has a sermon to tell, and the sermon that he wants to tell is, we will be saved by the fundamental aspects of male-female relations, sexuality, and a connection to nature. Graham Greene, to talk about this notion of the primitive and the simple ferocity of the age of caverns, and we're going to read him last with Brighton Rock, 1938. He believed very strongly that most of his fellow modern British novelists, Conrad being the only exception along with himself, took a great step backward in abandoning the topic of evil from their fiction. One of the things that Graham Greene respected about the 19th century Victorian novel, even though it had a very different conception of human psychology, human character, social interactions, was that people like Dickens and George Eliot and even Henry James were interested in society, but also recognized that there is evil in the world. And Graham Greene, who is imbued with a notion of this idea of the fundamental evil that's in the world, he converted to Catholicism. He worked as a spy. He sets many of his novels in an ambiguous moral landscape that has come to be called by critics Greenland. That is green spelt with the E at the end, like his name, Greenland, one word. He felt that Foster and D.H. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf and James Joyce were only interested in problems with people and society and not with evil. And so one way to think about this quartet of novels is that the first Secret Agent that we're doing today and Brighton Rock, the last one, are kind of bookends of dark novels when Howard's End and Mr. Dalloway are two of the most optimistic novels in the period. And of course, that's one way any society tends. Some people's responses to the modern age is to embrace, in this return to the primitive, the values that made human beings what they are. And other people, Conrad and Greene in particular, are always worried that our own weaknesses get in our way. A character in The Secret Agent says, we can never cease to be ourselves, as if we're bound in that prison of ourselves. And along with that, modernism also sought to respond to another experience, and that is of loss, the loss of a common world, of any public and shared standard of significance. Virginia Woolf wrote in 1923 of Jane Austen that she could believe that her impressions held good for others. And to believe that, to be able to believe in the early part of the 19th century that your impressions are identical to those of others, is to be released from the cramp and confinement of personality. I don't want to talk too vaguely here. That is, she envied the fact that Jane Austen could feel that her impressions of the world were not unlike the impressions of the average English person of her class. By the time we get to the writers we're talking about this month, they no longer believe that. They believe that one of the problems of the modern world is that we're all stuck in our own identities, and that art too often is not a bridge, but a wall. And so the critic, David Deiches, wrote that if the past and present are constantly experienced by individuals in a way that connect them to their own history. Think of Stephen Dedalus and James Joyce if you attended the Ulysses series. It may join them to their own past, but it doesn't join them to any public sense of history. Stephen Dedalus, the surrogate for Joyce himself in Ulysses, says famously that history is a nightmare from which he's trying to awake. These writers felt that they were channeling a feeling of the public, the reading public and the public more broadly, who felt themselves, in the words of Gertrude Stein, a lost generation, that after the war they had been uprooted from the world of history. You might think of the First World War as a great erasure of 19th century alliances and European grandeur, and that the modern world is very much marked by the sense of isolation and alienation. So the critic David Daiches, Daiches, wrote, "The isolation of the individual consciousness steadily became the most important psychological fact in a world from which public value seemed to have departed, and where every individual was seen to be the prisoner of his own unique stream of consciousness." That's a very important idea to keep in mind. Again, if you have access to the novel Ulysses in your memory, or to my talking about it, Stephen Dedalus is so consumed in his own mind in the first 3 chapters of that novel that the novel gets rid of him as a focus, and it starts again in chapter 4, backs up to the beginning of the morning again, and turns its attention to Leopold Bloom, who is not a prisoner of his own consciousness, who's a mensch and outward directed, and saved that novel from the narrowness of Stephen's consciousness. As a result, literary artists began to see that it was consciousness and not chronology that was the key to the representation of character. You didn't have to show somebody what happens to somebody like David Copperfield or Jane Eyre or Pip in Great Expectations by spending years to say, this is how they got to be who they are. Show them now in a single day, in a moment, and with an impressionistic understanding of their interior life, you can reveal them as the person they are. So this interest in chronology over consciousness is everywhere. There are experiments with time and the novel, as I mentioned before, single day novels in Ulysses and in Mrs. Dalloway, both of which take place in European capitals on a day in June, Dublin and London. There are the attempts by the professor in The Secret Agent, today's novel, to defeat time by removing the delay of detonation, by making a timeless detonator that will be that much more frightening because there's no delay between pressing the button and the explosion. By the rearrangement of chronological order in the narrative, I'll say that again, by the rearrangement of chronological order in the narrative of Conrad's novel, where chapters 8 and 9 of the novel 13 move back in time. So again, I don't know, and if we were all in the same room, I could ask you to raise your hands. But if a lot of you read or reread The Secret Agent, you know that one of the things it does is it fools the reader by not letting you know that it has skipped over an important passage of the discovery of Winnie's knowledge of her brother's death because of her husband's neglect. And 8 and 9 of the novel 13 bring us back in time. And then we realize, oh, the narrator has kind of fooled us, and does that so that we're shocked as Winnie is by the revelation. Of course, the attack on the Greenwich Observatory, which was modeled on an actual historical failed attack that Conrad mentions in his preface to the novel. Greenwich Mean Time is Greenwich Observatory is the marker of time, of world time. It is itself a symbol of time, which is why the original anarchists wanted to attack it, in the same way that the World Trade Center was a symbol of American capitalism and hegemony, which is why it was a focus of an attack. So there's time in the attack on Greenwich, and there are 13 chapters in the novel, which is 12 hours plus one. It's not just an unlucky number, it's a number that no clock has. No clock has the number 13 because the 24 hours of the day are the 12 hours twice. That's not an accident. Conrad's writing a novel about anarchy that also absorbs some of the anarchy in the way that it's told. So we should not lose sight of the fact that when David Daiches talks about being a prisoner of our own consciousness, what the word prisoner actually means. In Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, again, published in 1922, the narrator says, I have heard the key turn in the door once, and turn once only. We think of the key, each in his own prison, thinking of the key, each confirms a prison. That is, the extent of our empathy is that we know we're locked in our own world and we know other people are locked in their world. So Charles Dickens and George Eliot, like Virginia Woolf's Jane Austen, could believe that their experience of reality could serve as a way of connecting to their readers and to a shared world. For many modernists, the individual experience, as I said earlier, was not so much a bridge as a wall. And so loneliness and alienation are common themes of the literature of the first decades of the 20th century in England. And the remedy for some of the writers was not to keep seeking a connection to the larger world, but rather to the smaller one of friends and colleagues and sometimes family. E.M. Forster, again, one of the more positive of the writers, someone who is actually hopeful that problems could be solved, proclaimed that his faith was not in Christianity, nor in the state, capital S state, adding that he did not believe in any system of belief, but rather in personal relationships. And he wrote in an essay published in 1938 called What I Believe, and now 1938 is an important year. England and Europe are on the brink of war. You have a major novelist who's been writing for decades, or wrote famous novels decades earlier, who writes an essay called What I Believe, and you think that it's going to be patriotic and maybe xenophobic and maybe nationalistic and maybe warmongering. And instead, it includes the sentence, if I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying my friend, I hope I should have the guts to betray my country. Now, of course, he's trying to be audacious. He was also a homosexual that was not known outside of his circle. And I say that only to mean he was someone who found himself living kind of on the margins of what would be considered appropriate society. But he's quite serious when he says that, because what he means is, if you could betray your friend and you didn't have loyalty to a personal relationship that you know is real and right in front of you and in the narrow orbit of your life, we all move in some narrow orbit. What does it mean to be loyal to your country as an abstraction? Foster and other writers of his day favored the small society over the great society. So in a number of these works, you see people who have high-minded ideals, like the imperialist Kurtz in Heart of Darkness, also by Conrad, published in 1899. So a little bit earlier than the modern period, but on the brink of the 20th century. Kurtz has a big idea of bringing civilization to the Congo, but what he really wants to do is he wants to rape their wealth and their ivory. And he's undercut by the fact that Conrad gives him the name Kurz, which is German for small or short. These writers felt that if you could connect to persons and sensibilities like you, and the epigraph of Howard's End is the two words, only connect, only connect. If you could bring yourself to connect persons and sensibilities rather than adherence of the individual to a nation or a creed or an abstract principle, you would find yourself more effective and happier. So we see small societies in Howard's End where a family of dysfunctional people is slowly replaced through marriage and kind of informal adoption by a family that believes in personal relations and imagination and kindness and literature and culture. And we see it also in Mrs. Dalloway, where everything in Mrs. Dalloway at the beginning of the novel is pitched towards her throwing a party. And people who knew Virginia Woolf's work but did not know her, when they read Mrs. Dalloway, many people consider it certainly as one of her masterpieces, some as her masterpiece. I'm one of those people. When it came out in 1925, people thought that Virginia Woolf must be mocking Clarissa Dalloway for her fussiness about getting the flowers herself and making sure the party comes out well, and that this was a kind of a feminine, empty-headed, housewifey thing to do. They could not have been more wrong. Virginia Woolf admired that Clarissa Dalloway was bringing family and friends together. In her notebooks on her writing, Virginia Woolf uses the metaphor of a hostess for her role as a novelist, that a novelist cannot solve the problems of society. They can't tackle the big problems that the Victorian novel tried to address of poverty and human cruelty. The best it could do is what any host or hostess does, bring people together and compose them for a moment. And she would argue that rather than mock someone who's making a good party, think in our own lives how much we value actual communal celebration, even if it's modest. And the more so now in COVID and post the beginning of COVID, when we bemoan that we can't just get together. And I have said in the before times, before we were enduring COVID, that you're invited to a party by someone you work with. And what is it? The people you see all the time at work, maybe you dress up a little bit, maybe there's a good dip or interesting crackers, somebody brings some wine. It's not earth-shattering, but it is sustaining, it's nourishing. For a few hours, you're doing something different with people who are defined as a small society. Even if you've seen them often in other contexts, this is different. It has a restorative power. Virginia Woolf believed that's what reading a novel could do. It could restore you by having you compose yourself for a time. And in the same way that a party has a beginning time and on many invitations an ending time, if you're smart, the way a game, recreation, an opera has a beginning and an end time, and that composure of an experience of like-minded, not identical, but like-minded people would be restorative. So we see that constantly in Foster and Virginia Woolf. We will talk about that in Mrs. Dalloway, because those two writers are among the most hopeful of this group. But we see no evidence of it in the other two, what I'm calling the bookend works, darker novels, The Secret Agent, in which both the pathetically ineffective band of terrorists, I mean, are they not the gang that couldn't shoot straight, ill and living off of women and maybe demented, and the most robust of them, Ossipon, is someone who preys on women. And the family of Verloc, the other small society, effectively three generations, his mother-in-law, his wife, and although they don't have a child, her childlike brother, that family is a travesty of a small society of the kind that Foster's talking about, as the agents are, the anarchists. And you think about the police, the assistant commissioner, and Inspector Heat, you think about Vladimir and Ethelred. Everybody's working at cross purposes in the novel. Winnie's mother decides to move out so that the nuclear family, again, husband, wife, and virtual child, can come together. And because she leaves, she inadvertently causes Stevie to become more dependent on Verloc, which is what both she and her daughter want, and that leads to his doom. The secret agent that is Adolf Verloc is a triple agent. He's working as an anarchist, he's working for the police, he's working for the embassy. In fact, triples exist throughout the novel in the way I just mentioned, three generations, or the nuclear family of Winnie and Stevie and Adolf. The patch of cloth that is left over from Stevie's coat and that Heat astutely observes links Verloc and his family to the explosion is triangular. The symbol for Verloc's being an agent, he's agent triangle. There's even a little drawing of a triangle in the novel. He lives on a triangular closet and so on. So what's the point of triangles in the novel? Two's company and three is chaos. That is to say, if you're concerned about trying to nurture honest relationships, they have to begin with dyads, with people who meet upon things honestly. If everybody in this novel, and almost everybody is working as a kind of secret agent, plotting against the apparent reality, the result is devastation and chaos. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Conrad is fascinated by the notion that there is something anarchic in human nature, that the secret agency of human life is that no matter how hard we try, we are constantly getting in our own way, like tripping and having a bomb explode because you ignore the root of a tree. And that idea, which is also in the heart of darkness, is the most negative of the British novels until we get to Brighton Rock. And if you've never read Brighton Rock and you've been longing for a really dark book, have some patience, it's coming. The Secret Agent, by the way, was made into a film version in 1936 by no less an artist than Alfred Hitchcock, who called it Sabotage because he had already made a movie that same year on a different book called The Secret Agent. So that title had been used up. And that movie, Sabotage, has Sylvia Sidney and Oscar Homolka. And instead of a pornography shop, they have a movie theater. But you may be interested in seeing Sabotage. Don't confuse it with the later Hitchcock movie, Saboteur. It was also made into a movie, Secret Agent, in 1996. And there have been no fewer than 4 BBC television miniseries of it, the most recent one in 2016. So Brighton Rock, a very dark novel. And again, you look in vain in that novel to find the kind of sustaining small society that you find in Howard's End and in Mrs. Dalloway. So keep that in mind, that we're alternating between the darkness, the light, and the darkness again. So some of the other themes that we'll be seeing throughout the series, and again, I'm going to end my presentation slightly early so that you have time for questions and I can leave promptly at 6, and I apologize for that, not really double booking, but the tightness of that. And I thank Michael for his flexibility. So we'll look at the extended effect of the First World War throughout the literature. It figures most prominently in Mrs. Dalloway, where there's a significant character that she never meets named Septimus Smith, who is suffering what was called in the day shell shock, and turns out to have a kind of spiritual connection to Mrs. Dalloway. We will look at other examples of the modernist engagement with the primitive, the natural, the pre-civilized in these writers. We will see the artist as outsider in each of the novels we're looking at. And then another thing that is modernist is the idea of fragmentation or collage. So Cubism, Futurism, Dadaism, all these movements, Imagism at the beginning of the 20th century, are trying to redefine art as something other than the straightforward representation, that is, representation of reality. And the American author Donald Barthelme, whose dates are 1931 to 1989, stated in 1975 that the principle of collage is one of the central principles of art in this century. And it seems also to me to be one of the central principles of literature. And what is collage? But taking something, tearing it up, and putting it back together in a different order. That is absolutely an aspect, a very important aspect of modernism. It doesn't put it back in the same order, because why would you tear it up? But it puts it back and lets you see what was there originally, so that you can recognize what was there before and see what's new now. Picasso was one of the innovators of collage. And if you think of his sculpture, and if you haven't seen it, or you can't imagine it from my description, you can look it up online for a picture where he took the triangular seat of a bicycle. You can all imagine that triangular seat. If you can't imagine it, your bottom might be able to remember how uncomfortable it can be. And he soldered to it the handlebars of a bicycle. And when you put those two things together, it looks like the skeleton of a steer's head. Remarkable. Triangular seat, which looks like the bony carcass of a steer's skull, and the shaped antlers of a bicycle handlebar. And what's remarkable about that is you look at it and say, I see the bicycle and I see the steer. There has been something has been ripped apart, put together to form something new, but the old is still recognizable. And when I taught modernism to undergraduates, I would have with me a big illustration, a photo of that sculpture. And one of the students in class, inevitably, and almost always a male, would say, well, anybody could have done that. Right, but Picasso did it first. Picasso saw the possibility for not making an accurate representation of reality, but a disjointed, fragmented representation of reality. The kind of depiction that would have been unthinkable in 1850 during the Great Exhibition. The kind of viewing of things that just wouldn't be possible until you lived through a world war and the fragmentation, alienation, and isolation that I've been talking about. So we will see this example of fragmentation and collage in some of the works as well. So now I'll turn it over to David, telling me if he wants to channel any questions or comments. Keep in mind that I mean it when I say, and I think I've proven myself to those of you who've written me, that if you have a question that doesn't get to me in the next few minutes, or that doesn't get to you until after this event is over, something that occurs to you belatedly, if you email me, I will answer you promptly, even though it may be the answer is, I don't know. So Michael, I'm sorry for calling you David. I have another librarian on my mind in my distraction. I apologize. So,
It's quite all
Michael,
right. It's quite
thank
all
you.
right, Mark. I've been called a lot of things. David is one of the more mild. Um, so one question that came up early on, and you've probably touched on it a bit, but maybe you could just give just more of a concrete answer to it. Is the person is asking, what is the time period for the quote unquote modern period?
Yeah. So again, nobody wakes up and says, "Oh, look, it's the modern period. Oh, look, it's the Elizabethan age." But you can't go wrong by recognizing that to be a modernist writer, you had to be born in the 19th century. Because you're going to come of age in what is generally considered the modernist period between the First World War and the Second World War. So the 19 teens to the 1940s, or better, the 1930s. We are doing with this novel a little bit earlier because it's such a good example of modernism, The Secret Agent. But the next three works, and it's also true, I'm cheating a little bit with Howard's End, but the works of Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Faulkner in America, the writers I've mentioned more than once this evening, those are modernists because they're working between the two world wars. And Virginia Woolf's entire literary career can be tracked onto the period between the two world wars. She commits suicide as the Second World War is about to begin, and she publishes her first work in the teens. So that you can't go wrong with that rough sense of, say, 1920 or so to 1940 or so.
Okay, great. So, person is asking, for Conrad, is evil a mental aspect of the nature of things, or is it something that emanates from human weakness, i.e., original sin?
Yeah, well, let's be clear that there are lots of ways that something can come from human weakness that has nothing to do with original sin. So when that person says, i.e., original sin, you're answering your own question. Conrad does believe that evil comes from human nature, but I don't think he would have thought of it as original sin. Conrad, who was born to a Russian Polish family that had been a kind of aristocratic gentry and found their fortunes upturned because they were patriots trying to restore Poland to independence, found that he had to. Michael, could you mute yourself if you're going to keep typing? Found that he wanted to separate himself from his family, and as a teenager, 16, this is going to answer the question about evil. He joined the French merchant navy as an ordinary seaman. So turned his back on his parents' Polish heritage, which they were patriots about, and turned his back on his class. And they hated him for it, but it got him to learn French, and it got him to see what men did on board a ship. And then he switched over to the English merchant navy, learned English, his third language, in which he wrote most of his great novels, and saw again what people were capable of. Conrad believed that there's a tension in human beings. He would say men because most of his novels are focused on men. He spent a lot of his time on board ship with men, a novel like Lord Jim, a novella like Heart of Darkness, a splendid short story like The Secret Sharer, that there's a tension in human beings between wanting to be alone and feeling that they need to be connected to other people. And what is it that mucks up the works? People not being able to negotiate the solitariness of wanting to be alone with what it is to be with other people. And he calls that the heart of darkness. But it's not in Africa, it's everywhere. It's inside human beings. In Verloc's extreme laziness, there is a heart of darkness. In the professor's demented concern to perfect his detonator, there's the core of darkness. And again and again and again in characters, not being able, like Winnie's mother, who tries for good reasons to do something without feeling that she can be candid. Conrad would believe that there is something in the nature of human beings that gets in the way of communal action. And he believed, the way the more positive writers of the period believed, that if you wrote about it, people would get better, that novels could actually enlighten you. I hope that's helpful, but it's not original sin.
Got it. So, Mark, is there any particular connection between H.G. Wells and the secret agent? Conrad dedicated the book to him.
Yeah, the connection is that H.G. Wells is someone who's writing about science fiction in the future, and who believed, at least in his fiction, and we believe also in his professional life, the dedication calls him the historian of the ages to come. Conrad respected H.G. Wells as a writer, but he didn't believe that the ages to come were going to be an improvement. And so whereas H.G. Wells writes about a fantastic future, Conrad in this novel goes back 25 years to the 1880s, and he writes about a dismal past because he believes things aren't going to get better. I'll give you a good example from Mark Twain writing about the same time on the other side of the Atlantic. Mark Twain writes in A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court that when Hank, the New England blacksmith, mysteriously is thrown back to the Middle Ages, he helps Arthur and his knights solve the problem of losing in battle by creating a Gatling gun. That is a weapon of mass destruction. He doesn't go back and say, let me tell you the joys of civilization. He says, you want to kill your enemy? You guys are amateurs. And he creates a Gatling gun that destroys Arthur's enemies. That's because Mark Twain believed, like Conrad, that there's a heart of darkness in human nature, that there's something rotten that can be improved, but it's dark. And that's a great example of that kind of, here's what happens with modernism. In fact, let me say that Thomas Hardy, the great Victorian novelist who had the good fortune to live into the 1920s, like Conrad, wrote a poem about the sinking of the Titanic because he lived long enough, in which his argument was, look, this great technological marvel got destroyed by a hunk of ice, by the most elemental, primitive, unthinking thing in the world, a big rock. Shouldn't that teach us something? And Hardy's last poem that he had published, not the last poem he wrote, but the last poem he had published, and in many collections of his poetry, it is put in the last place, is called Christmas 1924. It's only 4 lines. This is not verbatim, but it's close. Peace on earth, we sing it, and pay 1,000 priests to bring it. After 2,000 years of Christian mass, we've gotten as far as poison gas. Conrad would have applauded that statement. Twain would have loved it. What have we done with civilization? We found a more effective way to kill. The gas and the trenches of the First World War were horrific to the modern consciousness, that people drowned on land in this green mist, this sort of chemical warfare that was nothing like what happened on the plains of Crimea or of Gettysburg. A radical different change in the delivery of death. It was earth-shattering. And lots of images in the literature of the day of the gas, of mist, of fog. Many novels like The Great Gatsby that don't seem to have anything to do with the First World War other than that Gatsby served and is mysterious. They are blighted novels. That wasteland of ashes below the picture of the eye doctor, Dr. Ecclesburg, that valley of ashes is like post-World War I Europe. that idea that progress only makes you better at killing. And, you know, we see that in our own age. In the Civil War, the vast majority of deaths were not on the battlefield. They were done later when the ability of medicine could not keep up with the savagery of the weapons. And if you remember any scene from Gone with the Wind, you'll remember the long dolly shot where an overwhelmed Scarlet is being forced to step up and be a woman and a nurse and a helpmeet. And as she walks among what looks like a few littered bodies of men dying but needing care, the camera pulls up and away, and you see that there are hundreds of men on stretchers with only a handful of people to help them. And the reason so many died was the advances of medicine couldn't keep up with the advancement in the savagery of destruction. In Farewell to Arms by Hemingway, Lieutenant Henry meets a nurse in a hospital in Italy, and they seem to bond. He finds out that she asked to be assigned to that hospital because her fiance is serving in the war in Italy, in the same way that he has volunteered to be an ambulance driver in that war. And she says to Henry, Lieutenant Henry, that's his last name, that she imagined that he would be brought in on a stretcher with a saber wound, and that she would nurse him back to health. And you imagine that he would be something out of Central Casting, you know, a bandage around his head with a little speck of blood, and a saber wound is kind of quaint from the Victorian period of the Charge of the Light Brigade. And he says to her what happened. And she says, he was blown to bits. That is, he was not romantically wounded. He was evaporated by modern warfare. In the novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, a German soldier's reaction to the First World War, they talk about the fact that the remains of a soldier are so small, you could pick it up with the spoon in your mess kit. Horrific. There's a lot of that notion that that's what technology and modernism have wrought. And that is miles away, light years away from anything you see in the 19th century.
Got it. So maybe one more, Mark. We've got, this is a good one. The year Conrad wrote The Secret Agent, political events in Russia became more turbulent and violent, foreshadowing the complete blow-up of society 10 years later. How much did this influence the book?
I'm going to say I honestly don't know how much. I mean, he was someone interested in political dealings. I don't know how much he kept track of that. But I'll say, if I can let this be my last statement and then wish you all good well, that one way to think about the Russian Revolution is it's the last gasp of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages in Europe ends in the 20th century with the Russian Revolution, that the feudal system of the Tsar and serfs existed for hundreds of years later in Russia as compared to Europe. And those Middle Ages are over at the beginning of the 20th century, when the Russian Revolution kind of merges with the First World War. So again, I hope that's a good starting place for having an overview of the period. Now that you have the kind of themes and some of the terms in mind, I'll be able to talk more in a more focused way about each of the next three novels. And I will see you next time, again, with thanks for Michael's, not David, but Michael's extraordinary skills in getting this together, and also his flexibility in terms of my schedule. And I can't see you all, but I'm glad to know you're here, and I hope you're all safe and healthy and thriving. Thank you all. I'll see you next time.
Thanks very much, Mark. We'll see you next week. Great session, and we look forward to next week. Thanks, everybody.